Hello, good morning, good afternoon, depending on what time zone you happen to be in. Welcome very much to the third in our series of consultations towards Canada's rare disease drug strategy. We're going to give it maybe a couple minutes more for everybody to get on, and then we've got a really challenging topic that we want to bring right into the discussions here. I have a little bit of a question here. What do you guys see? Do I have this?
Your slides are there, Durhan.
My slides are there? Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hello, I'm going to get started now, and welcome to what we're calling the Countdown to Canada's Rare Disease Drug Strategy 2022. This is the third in our series of webinars. We actually had a slightly different topic that we intended for today, but we really wanted to come back to something that was very important upon the release of the final guidelines from the Patent Medicines Crisis Review Board, and to really talk about how can we assure that our pricing guidelines are actually going to be a friend and not necessarily a foe in terms of rare diseases coming into Canada. And I'll introduce the panel to you very shortly. But let me just give you a little bit of background. So I'm Durhan Wong-Rieger, President and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders. And just to say, here is in fact the rationale for those who've been on before for what we're why we're doing this now. As many of you know, in October 2020, in the speech from the throne, in September 2020, in the speech from the throne, the government committed to an overall rare disease strategy. And recognizing that in order to have optimal drug access, we needed to have a whole system around us that was going to get us the diagnosis, expert clinical care supportive programs. This built on the February 2019 announcement in which the government had committed $1 billion to setting up a national rare disease drug strategy to be put in place in 2022. And I won't go through all of the other, supporting initiatives that have taken place, except to say all of these really point to the importance of having a specific plan, a specific program, a strategy that would be for accessing rare diseases, drugs for rare diseases in Canada. And we really feel like this is a great opportunity. What has happened, and this is expected, but actually happened, of course, in October, just this past week ago, was that the Patent Medicines Crisis Review Board released their final guidelines. We want to make sure that we can put that into the context of what we're trying to do in terms of building the rare disease strategies. What's the impact here? So this was the schedule that we have in terms of the webinar series. We've got 2 more that are coming up, and hopefully, again, you will be able to take part with us, because it does build to what we're seeing as our year-long consultation for next year. We will have a national consultation forum in December. At this point, we can tell you it's going to be December the 16th, and it will be a full-day forum, obviously virtually. Next year, we're going to be pursuing 2 lines of consultations. We're going to have what we call hot topics and pivotal challenges. We want to make sure that as we're building this rare disease drug strategy, that we're looking at what are the key challenges that are keeping us from being able to have optimal access to rare disease drugs today. Are we able to deal with these in terms of a new drug strategy? Because if we don't, then it makes no sense. What are the kinds of real challenges that we've experienced, but not only challenges today, but as we look into the future, the next 5 years, the next 10 years, what are the therapies coming down? And are we going to be able to build a strategy, a plan that is going to actually help us to make sure that we get access to those for Canadians in a timely fashion? We will at the same time beginning a series of provincial consultations, and this really is to make sure that we're able to locate what we're doing in the jurisdictions. We recognize that healthcare and drugs are still a provincial jurisdictions, and we know that there are differences across the country. So we want to make sure that we're able to engage people in their provinces, in their home territories, and to really provide that kind of input. We will consolidate that in May. We're hoping to have at the same time a series of surveys and focus groups which will provide further information for us. And our goal is to get to the end of the year with a strategy that will allow us to really be able to set up at least beginning in January 2022. I'm going to say as well, we have heard back from Health Canada, and we know that they will be also starting consultations, and we are hoping that and have had some real good discussions to talk about how we can make sure that we're able to collaborate and to be able to build on what we're all learning. So the timing, I think, is excellent for us to be able to do this kind of consultation, have input, and to know that we're going to be moving forward towards getting to that goal of having something that can come into place in 2022. So the webinar, for now, as I said, we changed the topic a bit to make sure that we're able to address what is a key issue, and that is the PMPRB guidelines. So how do these guidelines impact the entry or access for rare disease drugs? How does that triple aim help us? How does using a triple aim help us in focusing on the right drug pricing? And we do want to make sure that we get to the right drug pricing. What are some of the Canadian principles that can guide toward the drug pricing? How do we set up our drug pricing based on what we consider to be important in Canada? And what are some of the alternatives to how the PMP is proposing to and is thinking about implementing the guidelines in 2021? What are some of the other things that we should be or could be looking at? So this is our panel for this session. This is actually an amazing lineup. Kimberly Robinson, many of you will know from PDCI, Kim Steele with the Cystic Fibrosis Canada, Dr. Leanne Ward, who hopefully is going to be able to get to us in the midst of her very, very busy clinical schedule from Children's Hospital Eastern Ontario, the Bone Health Clinic, Marissa Poole, who is the Director General for Sanofi Genzyme Canada, Fred Horn, who's going to be popping in as soon as he finishes on another webinar that he's on, the former Alberta Health Minister, and has been a great friend to us. So without much further ado, I'm just going to give you very quickly, again, why this is so timely to bring it back to the PMPRB. And this is probably not new to many of you here, but just to provide the backdrop anyway. So the two main things that the PMPRB has been looking at in terms of the new guidelines is the change in the list of comparator countries, so that we can go from having 7 countries to dropping to 2 highest, adding 5 lower price countries with the goal of having a maximum rebated price that would be more in line with the OECD median or average. And I think this is something that has been, introduced, and I think I would say for the most part, I think it's not been very controversial for any of the stakeholders. The bigger challenge, of course, is the introduction of a set of economic factors, which would use cost effectiveness, cost per quality, therapeutic class levels to actually set the rebated prices, which is something that has not been done. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about why this is so very disruptive in terms of access to therapies, and especially rare disease therapies in Canada. This is just to put it into a little bit of a nutshell, is that certainly PMPRB has used therapeutic levels. What is the added therapeutic advantage of a new drug to actually set kind of where they feel the maximum price should be? And this is not entirely new. I think what is challenging is that we're now going to use not just the Health Canada recommendations or the Health Canada approvals in terms of therapeutic advantage, but also we'll be adding their own assessment using some economic factors and other kinds of factors that are really not very transparent, not very clear, with very little understanding in terms of how they're going to be applied, and frighteningly will be applied only by the staff of the PMPRB, unlike what we're doing currently, where when we're looking at value adjusted, when we're looking at value-based pricing recommendations, there is in fact an expert committee. There are in fact opportunities for clinical and patient input, and that it's actually done in a relatively transparent fashion with reports and opportunities to challenge and consistency, one building upon the other. So we know where these therapeutic levels or where these therapeutic advances are being used, and that the prices, or at least the determination of a price per quality, is at least open to some input and dispute. So this is our challenge, is that yes, PMPRB says that we will look at the therapeutic value as part of our assessing what the maximum price should be, the maximum rebated price should be. But unfortunately, all of this is actually left to the discretion of the PMPRB itself. And these are, in fact, as we said, non-negotiable to some degree, because this is what they're going to be setting. So it's not a negotiation. It's not an individually determined. It is, I mean, it's not publicly accessible in terms of how these determinations are going to be done. This is kind of what we feel, and I've used this slide before, and I think many of you have seen before. The goal with, from the PMPRB, and certainly I think there's a little kind of real challenge, is that we would move from where Canada is an indexed tier to where we would be closer to the OECD mean. And as you can see, this brings us to a maximalist price about 20% lower than it is currently. The challenge, as we said, is that it would actually move us even further down when we're talking about it in terms of a rebated price. So this is the new process in terms of how drugs will be reviewed. Again, I won't belabor it because I'm sure many of you who are on this have lots of experience in terms of working your way through the drug, approval drug access process, and looking at in terms of what are the challenges at each step of the way. But recognizing again is that this is the new process, and what it does is introduce considerable amount of additional steps that have to be looked at, moves the value-based assessments inside into the PMPRB, moves the therapeutic level assessment inside the PMPRB, and all of this remains totally within the PMPRB with very, very little transparency, and almost no other kinds of input, including what we have fought for so long, and that is the clinical and the patient input. So this will take some 12 to 24 months, we said, to get to access, so adding additional time to it. But most importantly, is also going to make it so that it's going to be increasingly uncertain, because there's also the opportunity to reassess even after a price has been adjudicated. This is kind of what I wanted to talk a little bit about, because I think we've seen the triple aim used in many respects, but I'm going to use it to talk about drug pricing. So what is the right price for a drug? And I think there's nothing that's magical in being able to say it, and nobody would believe that it's just the cost of production plus a profit, nor would anybody say it's whatever, we think that the companies could charge and they could make stick, nor is it what is absolutely affordable, to the payer in terms of what their current budget is. So it's not just what the developers want. It's not just what the payers are saying we're willing to pay, or even pay incrementally, but it has to be a balance of that. And the most important part of it, we believe, is that it makes sure that the price has to be so that we're going to get new medicines, and they're going to be made available to the patients. This is the goal. All of this has to happen. Yes, patients have to get access. Yes, it has to be sustainable in terms of our healthcare expenditure. And yes, there has to be sufficient incentive for developers to not only continue to develop drugs, but to bring them to Canada. All of this is critical. And I kind of call it, like, in terms of our pricing mechanisms today, again, nothing perfect. Nobody feels like we've got an ideal system. And in fact, there's lots of challenges even using this system, but at least today there's a bit of a balance in terms of how do we get to the right pricing, right? And if we think about it a little bit of this three-legged stool, the PMPRB has a mandate, and it still has the same mandate. It is that we do not have, Canada will not pay excessive pricing. So that's the PMPRB's role. It still remains their role, that we have non-excessive pricing in Canada, like Canadians do not pay more than what would be deemed appropriate based on a number of factors, including our GDP. We need one of the other legs of the schools is the payers. The payers have to believe that what we're paying for is going to be of value in terms of what we're paying, and the value is based on a number of things. What else could we, what other drugs are available for this patient population? What's the healthcare outcome, value to it, and how does that affect in terms of our other healthcare expenditures? And what is it that we should be contributing with regard to it being a specific type of a patient population? Is there, the necessity to make sure that we're able to compensate more for diseases that are severe, that are life-threatening, or for which there are no other therapies? Where is that value light? And it, relates to all of that, right? But obviously, at the end of the day, also then, where do we set our budgets and where do we make our healthcare allocations relative to other allocations? And for the industry, of course, that other leg is it's a negotiated rebated price. What do we want? What do we need? What are we getting in other countries? But beyond that, what else then are we able to provide in order to come up with something that's going to balance the other two legs of this stool, the other two drives? And part of it is, if this works, right? And if we keep working on this, we end up with patient-centered access. Our concerns is what's happening now with the PMPRB. Is that the PMPRB says, no, I think we're going to take over all of those functions. We are going to determine what the maximum list price is. And oh, by the way, we're also going to determine what the rebated price is. We're going to tell you what that value base is. We're going to give you the statement in terms of how much we think you ought to be gaining in terms of healthcare value. And we're going to make the statement that this is, in fact, the maximum that can actually be paid instead of being a negotiated payment. So the payer the payer actually has a very minimum role now, because the PMPRB says that's our job. And the PMPRB is saying to the industry, no, this is what it is that we believe, you should be getting, and we're going to dictate that. It's not a matter anymore of negotiation. There's not the opportunity to really make the case in terms of what else it is that we're trying to support here. What are the other kinds of services that are coming into it? We, in fact, as the PMPRB, are going to usurp all of that. And what happens, of course, is what we see here, is that at the end of the day, the whole system collapses. And what happens to patient-centered access? It actually disappears. So this is our concern, is that we're totally upsetting the balance in terms of how we come up with the right pricing. And I think this is kind of the start into what I want to talk about in terms of, okay, how are we going to then address this? And what we've done then, as I said, is bring together a panel, and I'm hoping that if I shut this down for half a second, I can find my panel here. Good. All right. Well, I've got parts of my panel, and I know that some of the people are beginning to come. So let me just turn directly to the panel that I've got. I've asked each one of them to give us a bit of an opening statement. Where do you see, where do you see the drug access system now in terms of how well it's working? We know it does. What does work? What doesn't work? But also then, what are your responses in terms of the new PMPRB guidelines as they pertain to where you are as a player in this industry? So I'm actually going to turn to Marissa Poole, and maybe just start with you, if you don't mind.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dohan. As Dohan said, I am Marissa Poole. I am the country lead for Sanofi in Canada and the general manager for Sanofi Genzyme. I have worked for our organization for over 17 years, and we were the first company to really pioneer treatment in the rare disease space for the treatment for Gaucher disease. So heavily invested in this area. So thank you, Dohan, and to Cord for your ongoing leadership. I know today's event is just the latest in a long line, and I'm really grateful to be part of the discussion. I think it's really important to recognize where we are on the rare disease policy in Canada, and equally and importantly, and while we're all here today, is what we can do collectively about it. It feels like the status quo is at a breaking point. And let's put the PMPRB aside for 1 second. It's increasingly obvious to many stakeholders, including governments, that our complex system of reviews was never really designed for the types of medicines that we're seeing in the market, and particularly in rare diseases and those in development. So diagnosing the policy problem is a necessary first step. Secondly, it's going to take collaboration to drive solutions. And I think one of the major criticisms of the PMPRB reform is the missed opportunity in the consultations over the last few years. It's never been made clear who was advocating for which changes and how and why legitimate stakeholder feedback was never addressed. And our alternative approaches were never really explored. If we're going to make progress on a national strategy for rare diseases in Canada, and I think we all believe that's what we need to do, we're going to have to do a much better job of setting objectives, bringing the right people together, and working together to reach those objectives. We've seen an unprecedented collaboration and partnership during this pandemic, and that needs to be carried forward and applied to address the crisis we're now facing in ensuring access to innovative and life-saving therapies for rare disease patients. Finally, at a time when this status quo system is struggling to evaluate and integrate many rare disease treatments into Canada's healthcare system in a timely way, the PMPRB changes arrive as a major setback in those efforts. So it truly is a perfect storm with opposing forces driving significant challenges for access to rare disease therapies. And rather than a patient-focused message from our health leaders of seeking to maximize access to treatment options, Canada seems to be sending a very different message. Access and affordability isn't, and it shouldn't be, a binary policy choice. Other countries have developed models that are worth learning from, and certainly our company and our industry recognizes it's our obligation to come to the table in the spirit of collaboration. To drive meaningful policy change, however, it's going to take a lot more. It's going to take inclusive leadership. It's going to take more voices at the table, and it's going to take political will to get it done. So with that in mind, I'm very much looking forward to today's discussion and appreciative to be part of the dialogue, Doha.
Well, that was a brilliant opening, Marissa, and I think helped us to put into great context, not just what the industry perspective is, but really, how does this affect us all in terms of Canadians? And I think, as you said, it also brings back front and center, the most important thing, and that is the patient at the center of this. And I think, when I put up that picture of the three-legged stool, right, what we ended up saying is that the only driving force was now going to be what is a non-excessive pricing, and not even non-excessive, but what is the least amount that we feel Canada could or should be paying. And I think that's the biggest challenge that, we have to kind of overcome here. The balancing forces have been kind of knocked out. Okay, I'm going to turn to you, Kimberly, if you don't mind. Kimberly is really needs no introduction to many of us who've been following the policy space, but is both a great technician, I know, and also a great policy analyst. So I'm going to ask you to talk about it from the perspective of certainly somebody who covers a lot of the aspects in terms of access to therapies, working, I think, on the side of both supporting the entry, but also supporting the patient organization. So I'm going to turn it to you.
Thank you, Durhan. Good afternoon, everyone. I would echo Marissa's comments that it's a great pleasure to be here, and I appreciate being asked. Boy, Marissa, you are a tough act to follow. You really very eloquently presented the entire problem, really from start to finish. I mean, we see efforts to reform regulatory systems to account for what's really a revolution in therapeutics and diagnostics. And, if we contrast perhaps what Health Canada is doing with their R2D2 initiative, which really does focus on a more broad healthcare lens, to what's happening at PMPRB, which is strictly focused on the lowest price and the lowest, the driving prices down as low as possible without regard to the impact. The contrast is really quite stark. When you layer on top of that a high degree of uncertainty around what's in the guidelines, even at this late date, we're 40 days from implementation, and my team has more questions than answers about what's in the guidelines now. We really are in a situation where we know of rare disease drugs and other drugs that are being delayed. Access is not available to patients to the extent that it is in other countries for some of these drugs. And blame for that lands quite squarely at the feet of the PMPRB. They don't like to acknowledge that. The answer back is that PMPRB is not stopping manufacturers from launching drugs, but in fact, the uncertainty that's been injected into the landscape in Canada for innovative manufacturers is the reason that some of these drugs aren't coming. And paradoxically and terribly, the more innovative the drug is, the more uncertainty there is. So, you know, that just absolutely runs against what we're trying to accomplish. And I, again, would echo what Marissa said, that this revolution that is taking place requires partnership between industry and regulators and payers and patients. It requires a dialogue and an open-minded approach to finding new ways to give patients access to the medications that they need, and a real fundamental shift, quite frankly, in the way that we fund healthcare. We can't expect affordability within the context of current drug budgets. That's not possible. We need to start thinking about, you know, the impact of cures on the whole system, and how we can shift some of the resources out of bricks and mortar and other things that need to be moved towards therapeutics.
Great. I mean, is Kim still here? Kim still, oh, there you are. I thought I lost you for a second. You disappeared from my camera. You're the most important person we've got, so I didn't want to lose you there. Yeah, so I think, again, you know, not to put you guys back in the eye of the storm, but we're going to be really looking at some of this as well. So Kim, I'm going to turn to you, Kim Steele, introduce, and maybe you can answer the same questions, because you've heard it from, I think, two slightly different, though I think very much sympathetic perspectives from a patient perspective, from your patient organization perspective. You know, what do you see has been working, and what are some of the additional challenges that we're going to see with the PMPRB?
Sure, thanks, Terhan. You know, with respect to the first question, thinking about the drug access pathway, and especially for rare diseases, how well does it provide access to Canadians with timely access, in particular to innovative medicines? And it doesn't. You know, the treatment of precision medicines, medicines that are targeted to the genetic, you know, mutations, and that in our case cause cystic fibrosis. You know, the way that they're called modulators, have rolled out in Canada just shows how our system is not equipped to deal with these types of medicines. There's one therapy in particular that treats Canadians with some of the rarer mutations associated with CF, and this therapy actually received a positive clinical assessment from CADIT, and was originally approved by Health Canada in 2012 for one mutation. There were other mutations added to the indication in 2013, 2014. So we're now in a situation in which some people who have one mutation can get the drug and other people can't, because the PCPA, rather than doing a line extension for these new additions, wanted to go back to the table to negotiate a better price for medicines that will help a very small group of Canadians. So, you know, I bring this up because 6 to 7 years for a drug that can stabilize or slow the progression of a deadly disease, you know, we would think that that is something our governments would want to invest in, but there are people still waiting, and it's deplorable. So we see that the system is broken right from the entry point into Canada, and then right through to the reimbursement and listing processes. So, you know, we need a fast and fair process for these types of medicines now, and one that goes from start to finish. With respect to the PMPRB guidelines specifically, you know, our community is already feeling the sting of these guidelines. There's a drug right now, a game-changing drug that treats up to 90% of our population with tremendous results. It's halting the progression of the disease in many who take it, and some people even come off the lung transplant list. It's estimated if this drug was introduced into our population now, that the overall median age of survival could increase by 9.2 years. But when the manufacturers asked about why they didn't bring the drug to Canada, they cite the uncertainty that come with the PMPRB guidelines. And as a result, this drug, which is the single biggest advancement in treating cystic fibrosis in the history of disease, may not make it to Canadians with CF at all.
Okay, well, and I think we've all lived through, I think, a lot of that kind of controversies, including individuals that have been directly affected. I'm hoping that we will actually be able to get our two panelists in as we move forward. Not a guarantee, but I'm hoping that Dr. Liam Ward, who is still going to be able to join us, and I'm hoping that Fred will be able to get there. But in the meantime, then we'll give them a chance to provide some opening comments. But now that I've got you, in terms of your brilliant updates, I'm going to present to you just two quick case studies. And the first one, of course, is one that Kim has just been talking about. But really, what I want us to do is not so much address these case studies, but they're a bit of a backdrop to say, where do we go then in terms of building a rare disease drug strategy? Where do we go in terms of trying to figure out how do we get the right pricing on these drugs? And going back to that notion of my three-legged stool, where the biggest aim, of course, is to make sure that we have timely access to medicines, right? So let me see if I can make this work for us. Just to briefly present, the first one, I think Kim has already kind of briefly given to you. It's a slightly high-level kind of variation on what she was just talking about, and that is a lung disease, has a genetic mutation, affects about, in this case, 1 in 4,000, about 4,500 people in Canada. And what I'd like to do is just systematically say, this is again a little bit of a simplified version of the reality of it, is that the first therapy to ever come out and actually truly treat this condition was in fact a single modulator therapy effective for a very small portion of the population. What the company has learned over clinical trials is that adding a second modulator to it actually made it more efficient, fewer side effects, and more patients could be treated. And now, I think, as we say, there's a 3-drug combination, which is effective for probably up to about 90% of this community, which, you know, less than a decade ago have absolutely no treatments that actually could address the disease, that took it from being a disease in which, you know, patients could maximally live to about 40 years of age to where there's the real opportunity for sort of near normal lifespans. The important things about this therapy is they're oral. They can be taken, you know, without a whole lot of additional hospitalization. The list price, and I'm just giving you those as stylized list prices and maybe not be actually accurate, it's about $300,000 per year. Interestingly enough, for the single drug, $310 for the combination, and let's say it's $325 for all 3 drugs. A health technology assessment was done on these drugs, and using a $100,000 to $150,000 cost per quality, which is kind of what PMPRB is coming back to saying, though they've reduced it now down to about $100,000. That say the price would have to drop to something like, and you can see it here, that range of $68,000 to $87,000 in order for it to be within that cost effectiveness ratio. Not to say necessarily that that should set what the price is, but if one were to use those benchmarks, this is what the company would be able to maximally charge through a series of negotiations. I've got to put in the second one as well, so that you've got them both in mind while you're talking, if you don't mind. So this is, again, a bit of a stylized presentation of a therapy that, again, I think many of you will know about. And this is, I'm hoping everybody sees the slides on here, is that it is, in fact, a, sorry, I just want to make a check. Can you see the screen there? Do I have slides? Do I have slides up?
Yeah.
Did I have slides up before? Maybe not. Okay, let me just continue on. This is the second case I would like to bring. And again, back to what Marissa and I think Kimberly were saying before, you know, can we build a system that's going to take us into the future where drugs are going? So these are 3 different therapies for a single condition. It's a genetic progressive condition, leads to muscle weaknesses, which will also ultimately lead to severe organ damage, heart, lung, and liver damage. It is, again, a gene mutation with the dysfunctional or defective gene. There's an essential protein that's missing and that would maintain muscle functioning. Depending on the specific mutation, the protein level may vary, which would determine then the onset of symptoms, the level of disease severity, and would also then affect the severity of the symptoms. 3 therapies, I'll very quickly, it affects about 1 in 50,000 people, so somewhat rare. So there's only a very small patient population that will be in Canada. The first drug to ever come out to be effective, came out maybe about 4 or 5 years ago. It's a bioengineered copy of the dysfunctional protein. It does have to be injected into the spinal cord every 4 months in order for it to work. It doesn't reverse symptoms, but it delays progression. So obviously, the earlier it started, the more that the patient will actually be able to maintain or to be able to develop normally. Second drug also works by boosting the protein that's essential to the muscle functioning. So whatever residual protein there is, it would actually help to boost it. The results are somewhat similar to the first therapy. The difference is that it's a daily oral therapy. So there's less side effects, obviously less disruption in terms of quality of life. The third one is this gene therapy. It's a one-time injected therapy. It replaces the defective gene with a functioning version of that gene so that the patient then actually will produce that protein ostensibly forever. But of course, we don't know because it hasn't been on the market forever, it has not been used forever. List prices, just again, these are somewhat fictionalized prices, but probably not too far. $300,000 a year for the first drug, about $350,000 a year for the second drug, and a one-time injection for the gene therapy of $2.5 million. Again, if we go back to our health technology assessment, if we take an ICER, again, what the PMPRB is suggesting, between 100,000 and maybe up to 150,000, what we end up with is a recommendation that these prices come in at something like 36 to 65,000, so somewhat at a 70% discount, and the gene therapy would actually come in at something like 310 to 900,000 as a one-time deal. So that's the backdrop. I don't need you to address the cases directly if you don't want, but I think our questions are, what would it take for us to build, a rare disease system that would allow us to be able to address these and to be able to make sure that we're able to build. If we're talking about building a rare disease drug strategy for the future, how do we make sure that we can accommodate these therapies? As Kim, illustrated to us, is one that we're living right now, so there's a challenge there. But we've also got the other that's also a evolving kind of a case. But before I do that, I'm going to introduce Fred Horn, who has joined us as a panelist. Fred, welcome, and thank you so much for rushing out of your other one. I hope they weren't too upset with you for saying, giving your talk and then scooting out of one window to the other, but we're delighted that you're here. Maybe if you don't mind, what I ask the other panelists to do is just give us an opening comment around, a couple minutes around what you might, I'm hearing an echo. Is that okay? Can we see everybody here?
Fred's MacBook Pro disconnected. Ready to pair.
Terhan, can you hear me? It's Fred.
I can hear you. I can also hear somebody else. I think we're getting somebody else's webinar as well. So this is very interesting. Let me turn to you, Fred. Maybe you can give us some opening sense, just a sense of, what's working now, what's our challenges now, and how do you see the new guidelines from the PMPRB affecting specifically our availability of rare disease therapies?
Well, thank you very much. And thanks for the invitation. And I apologize for coming in halfway through here, but it was actually another rare disease related conversation. So, I mean, in terms of what's working well, I prior to the introduction of, the proposed changes to the PMPRB guidelines, I think that, we had come a long way in Canada largely thanks to CORD, we'd come a long way in terms of thinking through what the elements would be for a rare disease drug strategy in Canada. The strategy in 2015, Durhan often describes it as a platform. To me, spelled out quite clearly what needed to be done in terms of setting up a specialized regulatory framework, making, developing, not just developing data capacity, but making use of data capacity in other countries and using, collaborating globally on evaluations of a lot of these drugs. There was still quite a bit of work to be done around reimbursement and how provincial governments could get something better than, as I experienced, having these decisions shepherded off to me in isolation to make around one patient for one-time access to one particular drug. But I think there was a good discussion that was underway. The problem, as I see it now, is that as well-intentioned, and we're talking about the proposed guidelines here. We're not talking about the people that work at the PMPRB. I think, if anything, we should recognize that, that regulator has been thrown into a position of actually going far beyond their mandate and developing underlying health policy, with, not so much on the regulatory side, but certainly policy that will affect the ability of not just reimbursement decisions to be made, but the ability of governments to develop relationships with companies, in partnership with patients to support research and development, and quite frankly, just better patient outcomes than we're currently getting. It made complete sense to me that from a pricing regulator point of view, that a review of the comparator countries would be timely. And I don't personally have any qualm with that part of the proposal. But where I do have a lot of difficulty is the uncertainty that these guidelines present to the market. So whether we're talking about the inclusion of the pharmacoeconomic analysis, I think that's the biggest part of it, but also looking at sales, the time frame that's involved with actually getting to a final maximum rebated price, because they're waiting for data to come in on confidential rebates. I mean, all of these things add up to a highly uncertain market that I think, patients will bear the brunt of that, the impact of that in the end. And as I've worked in health a long time. I worked in health policy for about 35 years. I'm not an expert in, telecommunications or energy or other parts of industry, but I just can't imagine any other sector of the economy where we would deliberately introduce that level of uncertainty over an indefinite duration and pose the risk that we're posing. I mean, we're here first and foremost to talk about the patients, but there certainly is a very important economic dimension to this. And there is a competitiveness. There are strategic market decisions that these companies make that, quite frankly, may not be decisions that go against Canada. They may be decisions that can't be made about Canada because of the uncertainty that's been created. So I don't think regulation should masquerade as public policy. I think if we want to have honest discussions about how provinces work together on price negotiations and what's acceptable in terms of reimbursement, if you want to talk about that, the place to do that is at a table with the provincial and territorial governments, and you let the regulator do their job in terms of setting that maximum price. So I'm in short, I'm pretty concerned right now.
Thank you very much, and you're the perfect segue to what I think the questions I would like to have the entire panel address, and that is, what are the principles? I gave you 2 case studies, not to say we're going to try to solve these case studies, right? But to say this is exactly what's here now and will be more like as we're going into the future. We've got these, highly innovative therapies, oftentimes the first therapies for a disease, therapies that address the underlying causes of diseases, can make significant impact in terms of not only patient quality of life, but the longevity of their lives. And, Canada continues to struggle to get access to these therapies under the current system. And now, of course, we're seeing that maybe not at all in terms of a future system, but also therapies that will be durable, that could be, using the magic word of curable, have long-term benefits. And again, how do we make sure that we're going to have them available? But before we ask, what's the right price to make that happen? What are the principles, as Fred was starting to say? Do we have any principles, either impugned principles that we're kind of working out of? Do we have any ethical principles that we ought to use to guide us in terms of how to get to the right pricing? We know we have principles underlining the Canada Health Act, but that doesn't seem to provide us with much guidance in this part. So I like to go back to my three-legged stool. We've got to make sure that we're going to be having medicines that come into patients. And luckily, in many cases, we do not struggle in this country with what many other countries might struggle with, and that is, can patients afford the medicines? There is, in fact, co-pays. There are challenges around it, but that is not oftentimes the patient's biggest concern, is that, can I personally afford the medicines? Quite frankly, nobody can afford a $300,000 a year medicine, so let's get beyond that. But can the system, what is it that a principle underlying, what should the system be allocating, towards these medicines? And what is the principle for industry? How do we, are there principles here? And Marissa, it's not surprising, I'm going to turn to you first, and to maybe speak to all of the stakeholders still, but maybe starting with from an industry point of view. Are there any principles here? And they could be, ones that you draw upon in terms of your, your global environment or your counterparts.
Great, thanks, Johan. And these examples, I think, remind us of our responsibility as companies and as an industry engaging in research and development, but also commercialization of the new therapies. And I actually spent the first half of my career in development, so I've worked on more drugs that have failed than have actually succeeded. And I've seen and been part of that development that spans for many years, and obviously the costs involved. I think it strikes me that we can and should be doing a much better job of engaging the healthcare system earlier in the process. Understanding the science and the clinical context is key, but at the end of the day, each treatment's going to need to be evaluated on its merits, and these rare disease therapies are so very different. So someone at the end of the day, is going to need to pay for this. So I think ensuring that we have input, and this is where the patient voice is so critical, early in the process. The earlier those discussions take place, I think the better. I think the second thing is really, and Kimberly touched upon this earlier, is the budget planning. The budget planning deserves more attention. Just as the science is evolving and we're seeing more innovative therapies come to market, more combination therapies, so too should the structures that we use to fund the innovation. So it's a hard conversation for anyone to have if there's no ability to adapt the budget envelopes to both short-term and long-term needs. You think of digital health. It's not just how we pay for it, but it's also how it's used. So many of the innovations that come from our company and our sector, I think, raise similar questions. So we need to be able to actually determine the value of those therapies and measure the value of those therapies on a long-term basis.
I love that comment. I will say somewhat flippantly, I remember having a discussion with one of the health ministers, and I won't say which one, a long time ago, and with the drug plan manager there, and they say, well, Durhan, these drugs are going to just be far exceed my drug budget. I said, well, I can solve that problem for you. Sit down with us, we'll tell you what the drugs are coming in for the next 2 or 3 years and how much we think they're going to cost based on the number of patients. You just need to ask for a better budget, and they'll be very squarely within your budget. So I think it is a matter of, what is the right budget? And it really has to be based on kind of where the patient need is. But as you're saying, does industry have a responsibility to also sit down with the payers and with the price adjudicators to say, okay, what will the system bear? What should be right? And maybe doing it collectively, because what are all the drugs that are coming in? And then that's not easy from a quote competitive point of view.
Yeah, and to your point, having those discussions at a global level, you're right. I sit at that table when Canada is 2% of the global pharmaceutical market, so it's a very challenging conversation to have, to ask that we have the lowest drug prices in the world.
And I love that comment as well, because quite frankly, we're not the cheapest country in the world, so we should not be paying the lowest prices. Kim, I'm going to skip over to you for a second, okay? Because I kind of gave one of your examples as well. But how do we then, are there some principles? What do you think should be the driving principles to getting back to that balance of the pricing? Because right now, you guys are in a standoff. You're not getting the drug. And it's based a bit on what Fred was talking about. There's so much uncertainty. How do we set that stool back up?
Yeah, thanks, Durhan. I mean, for us, it's pretty simple. The right price is the price that gets innovative rare disease medicines to the Canadians who need them in a fast and fair way. So if we look at the right price, what does that mean? Some people talk about affordability. The reality is it's the price that a manufacturer and our governments can negotiate and live with, right? And both feel good walking away from that table. That's the right price, and we're not there. The second principle there is innovative, and I think this was just touched on by Marissa, and it's, you know, we need to embrace the science, and we need to obviously make evidence-based decisions, but sometimes, you know, we have evidence in front of us, as we do with this new drug that we're trying to get into Canada. We have evidence that, you know, shows the tremendous impact that some of these medicines have, and we have no other mechanism to move them through the system. You know, there's a reason why the FDA can get breakthrough therapies to people quickly, you know, sometimes within 6 months, which is what happened for this therapy. And that's because they have 4 different mechanisms to fast track these types of drugs. The European Medicines Agency similarly have a process in place, and we do not. And so these drugs are getting bogged down by tests and treatments that were not designed for them. And I think the other 2 or 3 principles there are the Canadians who need them. How do we define need? Is need, you know, that you get a therapy through the special access program because you are, you know, on your last legs, or is need trying to prevent that from happening in the first place? And we have a real problem with I think, defining need in Canada, and we tend to wait, and particularly with some of the higher cost, very innovative therapies, we wait and we allow people to progress when if we, you know, gave that medicine sooner, they wouldn't necessarily have to progress as quickly. And then the fast and fair way. I mean, again, I just touched on the FDA and the EMA, so I won't exhaust fast, but we're not moving fast enough for these therapies. And fair, you know, we appreciate that there is a drug budget. We appreciate that our governments, you know, need to make hard decisions. But the decisions really gets back to that evidence base. The decisions really need to be made in ways that give people a fair chance at getting these medicines in the first place.
Thank you very much, Kim, and again, it addresses. I'm going to welcome Dr. Leanne Ford. Thank you so much. I know you've had a busy clinic schedule. You're trying to squeeze us in, and I appreciate the fact that you came in as well. So you're coming into the middle of a discussion. But you know, we were just talking about some case studies in terms of new and innovative medicines and the concerns there, and really, you know, how do we get to, you know, balancing out what might be the pricing that a company would certainly want in order to be able to continue to innovate. And also, I think as Marissa and others have said, to also bring it to Canada based on what else is being paid for in other countries globally. What about the challenge in terms of budgets and affordabilities, and sometimes in hospitals, hospital budgets, and how do they manage it? But also at the end of the day, you know, what is it that we want to make sure that can happen in terms of you know, Canada, and how Canada, one, doesn't pay more. I mean, I think that's what we've lost sight of, and Fred and me, others will remember. The reason we actually had the PMPRB was at one time, Canada was indeed paying a lot more than what would have been, you know, the responsible price based on our, you know, GDP. And I think the goal was to make sure we're not in that space. But I think what we've seen over time is a huge enlargement of that PMPR mandate, and now, of course, that last one. But Leanne, I'm going to ask you, maybe the opening question I asked is, how well does the system work for you now, and what are your possible, you know, kind of thinkings in terms of how, you know, more the PMPRB might impact your ability to get these new medicines for your patients?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a really challenging conversation. And I mean, the one thing that I wanted to say from my perspective is I'm very concerned about inequity within diseases and across Canadians in this space. I think, you know, one of the things I love about practicing in Canada is that I, generally speaking, except in the rare disease sort of space, I can offer what I need to offer to patients and it gets to them. And the moment we move into these very expensive medications, then within our clinics, we start to see these inequities where insurance pays in one patient and not in another. And that's, I think, for me, the guiding principle that we absolutely want to avoid. So that's number one. I don't want to be offering one patient one thing and another patient another thing because of these price differentials. And then I think the other consideration is that, you know, we have to pay attention to the clinical science, absolutely, but we also have to respect that the clinical trials are designed in a very specific way to show very important proofs of principle. But then when it comes down to the practicalities of actually getting these drugs to kids and adults, that will take us to a bit of a different place than what those trials might have taken us to, because we can't always absolutely adhere to those kind of trial conditions in terms of identifying who's best for medical therapy. So those are two things that are very much on my mind. In terms of the pricing, I mean, absolutely, we have to work together in a way that make sure that the pricing is responsible. There, you know, I think compromise and discussion is going to be a big part of that. And, you know, how we go forward in this climate is going to be very challenging in that respect, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and I think I appreciate very much what you're saying in terms of how do we make sure, though, that it is fair. And I think that's and equitable. And nobody wants to be in a position where you've got a patient in front of them and the first question that got out of your mouth is, do you have private drug coverage? Because that will make a difference in terms of what I'm going to be able to prescribe to you. It goes a little bit back to, though, the uncertainty, as you said, in that one quick slide that I went through, the challenge in terms of what becomes, you know, the price cap and how much rebate I'm asking you is on how much therapeutic level, I mean, how much therapeutic advantage you're offering. And the challenge is when that's done by one agency who, you know, has sole control over it, it makes it very challenging. Kimberly, we're going to almost be out of time, but I want to toss it back to you as well. Looking at these therapies into the future, you sit to, you know, in terms of very important spots in providing that kind of consulting advice. How do we go forward from here? And this is not going to be you know, satisfactory end to this conversation. So I feel like I'm going to have to bring all of you back in at a time that we can have this conversation part two. Kimberly.
Well, one of the things that we need to do urgently, if we talk about, you know, the topic here, the PMPRB reforms, is we need to stop now and we need to reset. The work that's been done to date, again, by, you know, well-intentioned people, is not going to work in the real world. There's been too little consultation, too much talking at each other and not enough talking with each other. It's important to note that the Standing Committee on Health is going to be studying this issue over the coming weeks, and actually submissions for people who would like to be heard are due at midnight today. I drafted one on behalf of PDCI myself today. And the other thing that we have to, I mean, beyond pricing, but it's fundamental to this notion of affordability. One of the things that I did as part of my submission was look at what is the proportion of healthcare spend that actually goes towards innovative medicine. So patented medicines tend to be the innovative ones. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of 6.6% of healthcare spend. And that, you know, may have been appropriate in the past when we, you know, were treating sort of GERD and high blood pressure. But now we're bringing revolutionary therapies that, to Johan's point, in some cases may offer cures for dread diseases. We're going to have to get our heads around the fact that the proportion of money we spend on healthcare that is dedicated to therapeutics will have to increase.
Yeah, that's a hugely important point. And thank you very much for bringing up the House Standing Committee hearings that are going to be taking place. For anybody that is intending to do a submission, it is due by midnight. We actually deliberately hosted this panel so we could get some more input from you guys in terms of what we could do. And I think important question came up. It says partnerships and collaboration are key as mentioned, but how will we measure success as we progress to the end goal? It seems like we're at, I think about to my three-legged stool, is that we're all clinging stubbornly to our own leg on that stool. And to some degree, as long as we cling stubbornly and we're holding up the patient-centered access, I might say, bully for you, just hang on there. But I think what we're recognizing is that it's not working, that it is fracturing. And I think that's important. So I think the other important thing I will say is that it's important for patients to enter this discussion. We have said in the past, and I said it at a time when it probably felt true then, is that, price is not the patient's concern. We should not have to be concerned about price. But what we realize now is everybody has to be concerned about price, not because we think these are too much, but because we have to make sure that as we get more and more of these innovations, we are able to bring them into our healthcare system, and we're able to bring them in as much as other countries are. We're able to bring them in across the board for every patient that needs them. So we do have to be concerned about what's that right balance. And I'm not going to force Fred to make the answer in terms of can we or can we not expand our healthcare budgets. I think they are expanding. The question is, are we expanding them in the right ways? And I think that's the key. But I think what everybody said here, and we're right up at the hour, so I'm going to try to draw this to a close because I don't want to, have people not be able to hear us end, at least at this point. I do think that, at the end of the day, it means everybody coming to table, and we start from where are we in terms of Canada? What do we want to make sure it's, how do we want to make these therapies available? But I'm also concerned that we have not answered the first question, and that is, do we want to make them available? Because I think for many of us as patients, we kind of feel like our government has said, we don't really care. The therapies are there. If you get access to the therapies, well, good for you. But we don't really care. Or we've heard if they come in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years later, well, that doesn't matter. It's okay. And we've also heard, and I think, Leanne, we were speaking about this just this past week, if in fact only part of the population gets it, and we start with those that, are fit the clinical trials that we talked about, and we kind of wait a few years for the others, or we only go to the most severely disabled and we'll bring in the others. Kim, that, right? You get access to the best therapies after you failed 1, 2, and 3. Well, how come we can't give everybody access to the best therapies? And again, this is something that's true, I think, throughout our system, from cancer all the way through, right? So I think these are huge issues. I'm going to really want to thank all of you for coming into this discussion. This was far too short a time to have this discussion. So I am inviting all of you. I think we're going to pick up this panel again. Hopefully, Marissa, you have not gone to Australia yet, or maybe you're back by then. Or you can, oh, no, it's easy. You can tail in from Australia. It'll just be the middle of the night for you. That I'd like to have this conversation again when we're having our one-day conference on the 16th. We need to have this conversation again. We need to pick it up again next year when we talk about hot topics. You guys were brilliant in terms of your assessments. I really thank you. And especially thank Fred for hustling in out of his other meeting. And Leanne, thank you so much for coming in from your clinic. And we had far too little opportunity to really take advantage of your expertise, but I know I've got you in another panel coming up shortly. So this is good news. Thank you again very, very much. And we will have another webinar series in 2 weeks from now. And we are going to be looking at how do we, aligning the processes. Can we get to a better, a pathway by looking at what's already been proposed in terms of alignment of processes, but also the ability for our value-based assessments to, respect what the regulators have actually identified in terms of innovations. And then from the payer's point of view, can we actually get to looking at budgets that are going to accommodate the innovative therapies? Because I don't think anybody believes that we can actually accommodate these innovative therapies with the budgets that we have now, any more than we can expect the hospital to operate on a budget that was designed for much simpler types of healthcare than we have today. So thank you folks very, very much. Thanks to all the people that tuned in, and we'll have a recording of this that'll be available on our YouTube section in about 24 hours time, as well as a copy of the slides. So thank you very much for your participation.
Thanks, Dahan.
Thanks, Dahan.